Great. Welcome to anyone who is watching the video or listening to the recording or whatever format this interview ends up taking. My name is Hannah, and this is part of the Mythical Writing Project. And today I am very happy to be talking to Dr. Craig Chalquist, who actually has two PhDs, so I don't know if that makes you Dr. Craig Chalquist. Yes. And you know, Craig does so many things. I'm not even sure I could fit them all into this introduction. And I'm going to turn it over to him in a second to explain himself. I'll give a little bit of context. I first encountered Dr. Craig's work, I think around 2014, when I was on a personal mythology kick. And I found that he was teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and that was one of his areas of focus. And I also read his book, Storied Lives, at that time. So that was more than 10 years ago, and here we are. So
Yeah.
thank you, Craig, for joining me today.
Uh,
And
Thank you.
so I know Craig as an author, a mentor, a professor. And Craig, your two PhDs, you have one in depth psychology and one in philosophy, cosmology, and religion. And could you maybe explain a little bit to the lay people in our audience what it is exactly that you do? What those
Yeah.
things are, or what some of the things you are doing now, and how something that sounds that esoteric is applied to everyday life.
Well, I'm still trying to figure that out too, but I'll have a go anyway. So I teach, I write. I mean, that's the surface way of understanding it. I do presentations, I do consulting. I run Lamp Cove, our online community. So, as Kurt Vonnegut's character Kilgore Trout would say, it's a full life and a merry one. It's fun to be up to all these different things. Part of what I do is there's a gap in our culture between things like the esoteric and inner work and dream work and mythological work on the one hand, and what we like to consider practical on the other. So I like to try to stand in the breach and make these talk to each other because for me, they're part of the same continuum. And I like to teach other people how to do that too. So maybe that's kind of a simplified way of putting it, but
And can you say more about depth psychology or archetypal psychology? I know it's a broad field, and it's not just you, but how that might be different than the what's conventional understanding of psychology as it's applied and what you do with that.
so for a long time now in philosophy, there was a lot of talk about what we would call the unconscious and how to get in touch with the back of our minds and what do dreams mean if they mean anything and what do symptoms mean if they mean anything. And then one day, Pierre Janet, who was a French philosopher and what we would now think of as an analyst, came along and he started putting these pieces together. Sigmund Freud heard about that and he started doing it. Jung heard about Freud, and then there was this whole host of people working on how the conscious mind talks to the unconscious, represses it, might have a troubled relationship with it, and how the unconscious tends to speak to us imagistically and symbolically. So it becomes a matter of what is it actually saying to us so that we can encounter life as whole people instead of just with our limited conscious mind. So there was a psychiatrist who came along in the early 1900s, Eugen Bleuler in Switzerland, and he knew about all this. And he thought, what you're really doing is you're not just dealing with the surfaces, like surface motivations and surface reasons that we tell ourselves. You're dealing with the depths of the psyche. So he actually coined the word Tiefenpsychology, which one translation of is depth psychology.
So, Um, and I think that Carl Jung might be a philosopher and psychologist that, most modern audiences have heard of, and if not read his work exactly, have heard some kind of interpretation of it. And today I wanted to specifically talk about the archetype of the hero. But before we even start that conversation, archetype, I think, is a word that's in popular use and gets thrown around a lot. And people, I think, by the nature of it, it's slippery. So I don't even know if people use it incorrectly because there's so many ways to use it. But could you give us your understanding of the word archetype?
It's such a confusing word, and it has a really long cultural history too. So a simple version of it is that an archetype is a sort of prototype, like a primary pattern of something. So I always think of when we read literature that's taught in a certain way in class, like in high school and college, where the instructor says, "Do you notice that the theme of resurrection keeps coming up in this story?" Or the theme of betrayal, or the theme of unrequited love, or whatever it is, right? So if you take words like that, big existential words, big life words like that, death, rebirth, the sacred, things like that, and you capitalize them, you probably have an archetype on your hands. So they're more like themes. They're not really nouns. They're not really things. They're more like basic themes or patterns. And each culture and each person fills them in with what they look like so we can actually know that they're there. And the hero is a good example of one.
So, on one level, we have a recurring theme or pattern. And I would hesitate to say universal or across every culture and every time period. Or if something like that does exist, it's really too abstract to think about in any kind of specific way. Like you said, maybe the hero has existed in every culture or every time period, but what every group does with it, in their cultural psyche could be different. So what one, culture, time period, or group thinks of as a hero or even heroism could differ um, from time to place. So kind of like an empty mold that's
Yeah.
that's filled by each group or person. And I don't want to get too much in this chicken and egg concept because I know there's debate about whether archetypes are like Plato's idea of a form, something that exists in its own world before humanity existed and they'll exist after us, or whether an archetype is, a human creation, something that's arising out of the stories that we tell that we go back later and say, oh, look at this theme. And to me, on a practical level, it doesn't matter that much. You see recurring patterns and that is something there and it's something powerful, whether or not it's its own entity or idea. And I've been thinking a lot about the hero, capital T, capital H. And I think there's even a reason that, you could say that's an archetype in itself, that there's a singular hero, or that uh, the attributes of the hero we think of as one individual in a story who represents all of those. And I'm sure anyone listening has their own idea of what a hero is with a capital H, if not specific heroes from media or pop culture or literature that they're drawing on. How would you how would you describe the archetype of the hero? What are some common characteristics?
Yeah, great question. And not to get too metaphysical, but I look for archetypes in nature because that helps me understand when they show up in the human world. So I would think of, for instance, like we hear some talk sometimes about an alpha male and an alpha female, and we know this kind of works with horses and other primates. So I see it there. One of my favorite images of the hero is weeds. They move into they're like Western cowboy heroes, right? They move into a situation quickly. Like if you stir up some soil and there's nothing growing, the weeds are usually the first ones who come in. They go down into the soil. They dig up nutrients to pull them up to the surface. They're very prolific. They're oftentimes spiky and hard to eradicate. and then they move on. They go riding off on their ponies, and then more mature ecosystems move in, right? So for me, the hero is somebody who comes into a situation. They tend to be loners, oftentimes, and there's some kind of massive imbalance happening, and they restore the status quo usually in spectacular ways. Sometimes they bring other heroes with them, like Jason and the Argonauts. Sometimes they prefer to work by themselves, like Heracles. But they come in and they do things. Heroes are in a way, action hero is redundant. All heroes are about action, right? So they come in, they make a change, and then they leave. They're often very impulsive, and in other cultures, there's more recognition than in the States that they're very dangerous. So Gilgamesh, uprooting entire forests. And so this is partly why Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey and says the hero needs tempering. Percival, who was his favorite hero, was a menace when he was younger. And he needed to do all kinds of things to get initiated. He showed up in Camelot, and Arthur went into the kitchen with you. You're not going to be a round table knight yet. You're dangerous. Into the kitchen. You're going to learn to cook first. So heroes have to undergo that, and many of them don't make it. So a lot of them don't get through it. Cuchulainn, the Irish hero, he doesn't survive initiation. One could argue Heracles doesn't either. Gilgamesh just he goes on a quest and fails, and then he just kind of peters out and says, well, I built a nice city. So they often don't get through the hero's journey. When they do, then they tend to become exemplary. So that's in a nutshell how I would describe the hero. And that's regardless of gender or sex. So.
It's interesting to me that the exemplary part came at the end, because I think that's mostly what's at the forefront of people's mind. You think of a hero
Yeah,
as a role model, as an idol or an icon. For me, I think the hero can be equated not just with action, but the action that saves. So this hero could be the savior that or later becomes the king or the ruler. Um, so it's interesting to me that you presented that as the end of a process
yeah,
through which somebody starts out, if not young, then unformed or uneducated, undisciplined, or immature in some way, then goes through a series of initiatory trials and some tasks that they have to fulfill before before they reach that stage. And I know Joseph Campbell is a figure I've had a complicated relationship with his work since that time that I first discovered, your
yeah,
work. That's what led me to it, to your work and to others. And I learned how complicated this hero's journey, or that the monomyth, that there's one cycle that every hero in every culture goes through, that the monomyth is itself a myth, a simplification of something complicated. And to further complicate it, I'm thinking about what you said with the example of weeds, because I think in a lot of, depending on your perspective, most people I think would say the weed is the villain. The weed
uh,
is the thing that needs to be eradicated. But when you look at it from the perspective of the weed, the unwanted plant, it's very resilient, resourceful. It goes against odds. There's sacrifice, endurance. So I guess too that a definition of hero or heroism could depend on the perspective. Um,
yeah. There's there was a movie called Master and Commander about a famous sea captain in fiction, and at one point a scientist in the Galapagos before Darwin discovers different plants and animals, and he wants to name one after Captain Aubrey, and he goes name a weed after me because I'm really hard to kill, right? But so where the hero is, the monster appears. I think they're the two sides of a split archetype. Batman needs the Joker. The Joker's so
yes.
much funnier than Batman. Batman's just really serious, and the Joker's like cracking everybody up, even though he's a maniac. But they're, Gilgamesh and Humbaba, and they all have something, whether it's one anti-hero or villain counterpart or a whole bunch of them. right? And I think they're part of the same archetype, and other cultures understand that better than we do. We tend to idealize the positive half of the hero and forget about the other or split it off, right?
And this is something that I really like. I've heard you say that something similar before, and it's in your work too, that the hero creates the monster or the hero precipitates the monster, if not, physically creating it like, Frankenstein or something. But you can't, and it's not just that, well, without the monster, the hero would have nothing to fight. But I think this larger perspective that these all exist in some kind of interrelated cosmology or ecosystem within a culture or within the story that's framing it. And it's very interesting because when I think of a lot of hero stories, whether it's, the more classical Greek and Roman ones or ancient ones that you've mentioned, or even more modern renditions, it's like, oh, there's some problem, something is terrorizing the city, or there's some, beast out in the wilderness that's a threat to us. And it seems like the problem comes first, and then there's this, character who is unassuming at the start, who has to rise to the occasion and deal with it. But if you think of it more, not that the hero is a response to the threat, but that these things coexist in
Yeah.
some kind of way. And that's, I think, a little, I'm saying it like it's an easy thing to understand, but when I think about it harder, it's actually a little bit more complicated. And I'm not,
The
yeah,
hero
go ahead.
is, according to Dennis Patrick Slattery, the hero is a being of large appetites. And I would extend that and say the hero has large everything, right? So when the hero is repressing part of himself or herself or themselves, that has to show up huge, right? So Batman's lack of a sense of humor, for instance, or Thor is an example. There's a great story about Thor from the Eddas where he's challenged to, and Thor's as big as a mountain, right? He's challenged to lift up this old woman off the ground, and he can't do it. And so he's bewildered, and he's like, "What is this? She's tiny, and I can't lift her." And somebody says, "She's old age, and you can't change old age." So that's often another part of the hero story. They have to learn their limitations. And Thor is, up until that point, in denial about his own weaknesses and limitations, and he learns an important lesson from that. I like Thor because he's an example of a hero that learns.
Mm.
So,
And I'm thinking about what you said earlier that, you know, I think a lot of ways of thinking of the hero is that it's one exceptional person who can do just about anything and will save you in the crisis and, meet all the villains and enemies. And that's, I think, a little different way than thinking the hero is one player in a cast and has a particular role that, he, she, they must fulfill in order for the others to fulfill their roles. So, when you were talking about the weed, the weed comes first to clear out the way for other things. So the hero has to do these things in order for the rest of the story to move forward or for there to be any change. But the hero isn't the end all be all only character, main character, or even the most important character, if you could say that any character is more important than any other.
a Jungian way of saying it is that archetypes appear in families.
Mm.
There's a very funny interaction in the Avengers movies between Thor and Doctor Strange, who would be the archetypal wizard or mage. And, they're on equal footing. I mean, they go back and forth, and at one point, Thor looks at him and he goes, "Oh, so Earth has wizards now. All right, wizard, who are you and why should I care?" And it turns out that Doctor Strange knows where Thor's father is hiding and Thor doesn't. So he needs him.